In the 13th century before the Common Era, the Nile River Valley supported a network of administrative centers, agricultural estates, and religious institutions that had existed in recognizable form for more than a millennium. The Kingdom of Egypt, divided by convention into upper and lower regions corresponding to the river's flow from south to north, maintained control over territories extending from the Mediterranean coast through Nubia and into regions of the Near East. This control depended upon a system of temple economies, scribal bureaucracies, and military garrisons that had been refined across numerous dynasties. The position of Pharaoh served as the administrative and religious apex of this system, combining responsibilities for military command, temple construction, agricultural oversight, and the performance of rituals understood to maintain cosmic order. The concept of Ma'at, a term encompassing order, justice, truth, and cosmic balance, provided the ideological foundation for royal authority. Pharaohs were expected to uphold Ma'at through the construction and maintenance of temples, the organization of festivals, the administration of justice, and the defense of Egypt's borders. These expectations created substantial material demands. Temple construction required the quarrying and transport of stone from sites often located hundreds of miles from building locations. The maintenance of armies necessitated systems for grain storage, weapon production, and the training of chariot forces and infantry units. Foreign trade brought cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and incense from Punt. The management of these activities required extensive record-keeping by scribal officials who documented grain harvests, temple revenues, military campaigns, and construction projects on papyrus scrolls and temple walls. Religious practice centered upon temples that functioned as economic institutions as well as sites of ritual activity. Temples owned agricultural land, employed craftsmen, maintained livestock, and controlled access to luxury goods. The priesthood formed a hereditary class with specific responsibilities for daily rituals, festival celebrations, and the care of divine statues. The largest temples, such as those at Karnak and Luxor, dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, commanded enormous resources and wielded considerable political influence. The high priest of Amun at Karnak controlled estates throughout Egypt and commanded labor forces that could be mobilized for construction projects. Royal donations to temples, recorded in inscriptions on temple walls and stelae, represented significant transfers of wealth and demonstrated the pharaoh's piety and generosity. The military establishment had evolved over centuries to meet changing strategic requirements. By the 13th century, before the Common Era, Egyptian forces included chariot divisions, infantry units equipped with bronze weapons, and auxiliary forces recruited from Nubian territories. Chariots, introduced during the Second Intermediate Period when foreign rulers controlled portions of Egypt, had become the elite arm of the military. Chariot forces required extensive training in horsemanship, archery, and coordinated battlefield maneuvers. Infantry units used spears, swords, shields, and bows, with equipment often provided by temple workshops. Military campaigns followed seasonal patterns, with major expeditions typically launched after the annual Nile flood when agricultural work required less labor and roads became passable. Egypt's position in the Near East during this period involved complex diplomatic and military relationships with neighboring powers. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, controlled territories in Syria and maintained treaty relationships with smaller kingdoms in the region. The Kingdom of Mitanni, once a major power, had declined but remained a factor in regional politics. Numerous, small, Kingdoms and city-states in Syria and Canaan maintained varying degrees of independence and often shifted allegiances between Egypt and the Hittites depending on military circumstances and diplomatic incentives. Egypt sought to control trade routes, connecting the Nile Valley with Syria and Mesopotamia, routes that carried commodities essential to the Egyptian economy. The practice of royal succession in Egypt followed principles that combined bloodline descent with practical considerations of age, capability, and political support. Pharaohs often designated co-regents during their lifetimes, allowing designated successors to gain experience in royal responsibilities before ascending to sole rule. These co-regencies might last for years, creating periods when two kings ruled simultaneously. Royal wives held significant status, particularly the great royal wife, who bore the heir to the throne. Children of royal birth received education appropriate to their potential roles, with princes learning military skills, administrative procedures, and religious duties, while princesses prepared for diplomatic marriages or lives within the royal household. The architectural legacy of previous dynasties provided both inspiration and practical models for royal building projects. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom demonstrated the capacity of centralized authority to mobilize labor and resources on an unprecedented scale. The temple complexes of the Middle Kingdom established architectural conventions for sacred spaces. The New Kingdom, which had begun several centuries earlier, had seen an expansion of temple building and the development of elaborate tomb structures in the Valley of the Kings. Each pharaoh sought to contribute to this architectural tradition through construction projects that would ensure their name's preservation and demonstrate their devotion to the gods. Daily life for most Egyptians followed rhythms determined by agricultural cycles and religious calendars. Farmers worked land owned by temples, the crown, or private estates, paying taxes in grain and providing labor for state projects during seasons when agricultural work slowed. Craftsmen specialized in pottery, metalwork, textile production, or stone carving, often working in temple or palace workshops. Scribes, trained in the complex hieroglyphic and hieratic writing systems, staffed administrative offices throughout the kingdom. Women managed households, participated in textile production, and could own property and engage in legal transactions. The social hierarchy placed the royal family at the apex, followed by high officials, priests, military officers, scribes, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers, with slaves forming a small portion of the population, primarily consisting of war captives. The religious calendar structured time through festivals that marked seasonal changes, honored specific deities, and commemorated royal events. The Opet festival at Thebes celebrated the renewal of royal power through rituals connecting the pharaoh with the god Amun. The beautiful festival of the valley involved processions to the west bank of the Nile, where royal mortuary temples stood. These festivals required elaborate preparations, including the production of food offerings, the crafting of festival items, and the organization of processions involving priests, officials, and representations of divine statues carried in sacred boats. Participation in festivals reinforced social bonds and demonstrated the integration of religious, royal, and community identities. Into this world of established institutions, complex diplomatic relationships, and ancient traditions, a prince was born in the year 1303 before the Common Era. His birth occurred during the reign of his grandfather, Ramses I, the founder of the 19th dynasty, who had risen to power after a distinguished military career. The circumstances of this birth took place within the context of a family that had recently assumed royal authority, replacing the previous dynasty through a combination of military prowess, administrative capability, and strategic marriages. The prince, who would become known as Ramses II, entered a world where royal power rested upon military strength, priestly support, bureaucratic efficiency, and the careful maintenance of relationships with both internal elites and foreign powers. The royal residence at the time of his birth was located at Memphis, the ancient capital situated at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. Memphis had served as an administrative center since the earliest dynasties and maintained significant temples, military installations, and the workshops necessary to support royal activities. The palace complex at Memphis included residential quarters for the royal family, audience halls for receiving officials and foreign envoys, administrative offices where scribes maintained records, workshops where craftsmen produced goods required for royal consumption, and temple offerings, and gardens that provided both food and aesthetic pleasure. Within this environment, the routines of royal life proceeded according to long-established patterns modified by the particular circumstances and preferences of each reign. The infant prince received the name Ramses, meaning Ra has fashioned him, connecting his identity to Ra, the sun god central to Egyptian cosmology and royal ideology. This naming followed conventions that associated royal children with major deities, establishing from birth the divine connections that would legitimize their eventual rule. The child's father, Seti, held the position of heir apparent and co-regent with his father Ramses I, combining military command with administrative responsibilities and ritual duties. The prince's mother, Tuya, came from a non-royal background but had been elevated through her marriage into the royal family, a pattern not uncommon when military men rose to pharaonic power and brought their existing families into the royal household. The household in which the young Ramses grew included not only his parents but also attendants, tutors, and various officials whose responsibilities involved the care and education of royal children. Royal children did not experience the isolation that might characterize childhood in smaller family units, but instead lived within a complex social environment where hierarchies of service and duty structured daily interactions. Wet nurses, appointed from among suitable women, provided early care. As the child grew, male tutors assumed responsibility for education, while female attendants continued to oversee domestic aspects of daily life. The presence of other children, including potential siblings and children of nobles attached to the royal household, created a social environment that mixed education with the formation of relationships that might prove significant in later years. Education for a prince destined for high office, perhaps for kingship, itself followed curriculum established by tradition and refined through generations of royal instruction. The young Ramses would have been taught to read and write hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts, beginning with simple texts and progressing to religious and administrative documents. Mathematical instruction provided skills necessary for administrative work, including the calculation of areas, volumes, and quantities needed for construction projects and resource management. Religious instruction introduced the mythology, rituals, and theological concepts that formed the foundation of Egyptian religion and royal ideology. The boy learned prayers, offering formulas, and the narratives of gods whose actions shaped the cosmos and whose favor kings sought through proper ritual observance. Physical training complemented intellectual education. Young princes learned to handle weapons, including the composite bow, spear, and sword. Archery required particular skill and years of practice to master the draw, strength and accuracy needed for both hunting and warfare. The composite bow, constructed from wood, horn, and sinew, represented sophisticated military technology that demanded strength and technique to use effectively. Chariot driving constituted another essential skill for royal princes. The light, two-wheeled war chariot pulled by two horses required coordination, balance, and the ability to control the horses while managing weapons. Training grounds attached to royal residences provided space for these military exercises, conducted under the supervision of experienced officers who had served in campaigns and could instruct princes in tactics and battlefield procedures. The training in archery began with lighter bows designed for children and progressively advanced to weapons requiring greater strength and skill. Instructors taught proper stance, the positioning of feet and shoulders, the drawing technique that distributed the bow's pull across back and arm, muscles, the aiming method that accounted for distance and wind, and the release that sent the arrow smoothly toward the target. Practice sessions occupied hours each day, with the young prince shooting at targets placed at varying distances and sometimes at moving targets to simulate the challenges of hunting or combat. The ability to shoot accurately from a moving chariot represented the highest level of skill, requiring the archer to coordinate with the chariot driver, compensate for the vehicle's motion, and maintain accuracy despite the rough terrain that chariots often crossed. Spear training introduced the young prince to another essential weapon of ancient warfare. The spear served both as a thrusting weapon in close combat and as a throwing weapon at medium range. Instructors taught the proper grip, the stance that provided stability and power, the thrusting techniques used against enemy infantry or from chariot combat, and the throwing methods that could strike enemies at distance. Shields accompanied spear training, with the prince learning to use the large rectangular shields that protected the body while allowing mobility and the ability to strike with the spear. Mock combat with wooden weapons allowed princes to practice these techniques against opponents without the danger of serious injury. The sword, made of bronze and typically shorter than later iron swords, served as a weapon for close combat when spearfighting closed to hand-to-hand range. The curved khopesh sword, characteristic of Egyptian warfare, required training in slashing techniques that maximized the weapon's cutting power. Straight swords demanded thrusting and cutting skills suited to their design. Training with swords involved exercises developing strength, speed, and the combination of offensive and defensive techniques needed to survive close combat. The prince learned footwork, positioning, how to read an opponent's intentions, and the decisive strikes that could end combat quickly. The death of Ramses I occurred when the young prince was still in early childhood, perhaps around the age of 3 or 4. This event brought the prince's father to sole rule as Seti I in approximately 1290 before the Common Era. The transition of power followed established protocols involving funeral rites for the deceased pharaoh, coronation ceremonies for the new king, and the assumption of royal titles and regalia. For the young Ramses, this transition meant his father now bore the full weight of royal responsibilities and that he himself moved closer to the succession. The child would have witnessed the elaborate funeral preparations for his grandfather, though his understanding of mortality and kingship at such a young age would have been limited to impressions and emotions rather than full comprehension of the political and religious significance of these events. The funeral of Ramses I would have involved the child prince in peripheral ways, perhaps requiring his presence at certain ceremonies but not imposing upon him the full burden of ritual responsibilities that adult participants bore. The procession carrying the mummy to the tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the burial rites performed by priests, and the offerings presented to ensure the deceased king's successful passage to the afterlife all proceeded according to traditions refined over centuries. The young prince would have observed these events, forming early impressions of the rituals surrounding death and kingship that would later inform his own understanding of royal mortality and the importance of proper burial arrangements. Seti I embarked upon an active reign, characterized by military campaigns to restore Egyptian control over territories in Syria and Canaan that had become contested during previous reigns. These campaigns required the king's absence from Egypt for extended periods during the campaign season. During such absences, the administration of the kingdom continued under the supervision of high officials, particularly the vizier, who served as the king's chief administrator. For the young prince, his father's campaigns would have been distant events, reported through messengers and commemorated in temple inscriptions, rather than experiences in which he directly participated during his early childhood years. The reports brought back from campaign provided the young prince with indirect education in military matters and geography. Messengers described battles fought, cities captured, and enemies defeated. They brought maps drawn on papyrus, showing the routes armies had followed and the locations of important cities and fortifications. They carried tallies of prisoners taken, livestock captured, and booty obtained from conquered territories. These reports, delivered in formal audience sessions where officials and military commanders presented information to the king, allowed the prince to observe how information was collected, verified, and used to make decisions about subsequent military and diplomatic actions. The royal court at Memphis and later at Ramesses, a new capital city that Seti I began developing in the eastern Nile delta, formed the social environment of the prince's youth. Court life involved formal ceremonies, religious festivals, diplomatic receptions, and the daily business of government. The prince would have observed his father receiving foreign ambassadors, consulting with officials about administrative matters, and performing religious rituals at temple ceremonies. These observations provided practical education in the conduct of kingship that complemented the formal instruction he received from tutors. The young Ramses saw how a pharaoh balanced military leadership with religious duties, how diplomatic correspondence was conducted, how building projects were planned and supervised, and how justice was administered in cases brought before the royal court. The observation of justice proceedings introduced the prince to legal concepts and procedures. Cases brought before the pharaoh or his designated judges involved disputes over property, accusations of crimes, and appeals from lower court decisions. Witnesses testified, documents were presented and examined, and judges deliberated before announcing verdicts. The principle of Ma'at guided these proceedings, with judges seeking to restore order and balance through their decisions. Punishments for crimes ranged from fines and restitution to physical punishment and, for serious offenses, execution. The prince learned that justice formed one of the fundamental responsibilities of kingship, one that required attention to evidence, fairness in judgment, and the maintenance of social order through the proper application of law. Relationships with siblings shaped the prince's early years. While the exact number and identity of all Seti I's children remains uncertain in historical records, it is known that Ramses had at least one sister and possibly other siblings from his father's various wives. Royal families practiced polygamy, with pharaohs maintaining multiple wives of varying status. The great royal wife held the highest position, but other wives also bore children who might play roles in dynastic succession or diplomatic marriages. The prince's position as heir apparent, likely established during his childhood, gave him particular status among royal children, but he would have grown up alongside half-siblings and the children of high officials who resided at court or visited for extended periods. Religious festivals punctuated the calendar and provided occasions for the young prince to observe and eventually participate in state rituals. The said festival, a royal jubilee ceremony intended to rejuvenate the pharaoh's power, involved elaborate rituals performed at specific intervals of a reign. The Opet festival brought processions from Karnak to Luxor Temple, involving the transport of divine statues in sacred boats carried by priests. The Valley Festival included processions to the West Bank mortuary temples. Participation in these festivals, even in limited childhood roles, introduced the prince to the religious duties that would later occupy substantial portions of his time as king. The festivals also demonstrated the relationship between royal power and divine favor, a connection reinforced through temple reliefs, hymns, and ritual performances that portrayed pharaohs as the earthly representatives of divine order. As Ramses approached adolescence, his education would have intensified and become more specialized. Advanced religious instruction might have included temple visits where priests explained ritual procedures, the meanings of sacred texts, and the proper performance of offerings. Administrative training could have involved observation of scribal work, attendance at court sessions where legal cases were decided, and introduction to the complexities of managing temple estates and military provisions. Military training would have progressed from basic weapons handling to more sophisticated tactical instruction, possibly including participation in military reviews and demonstrations where chariot maneuvers and infantry formations were practiced. Hunting expeditions in the desert margins provided both recreation and practical training in the skills necessary for warfare, including tracking, endurance, and the ability to function in harsh environmental conditions. The construction projects undertaken by Seti I provided another arena for the prince's education. The king commissioned work at the great temple of Amun at Karnak, built a mortuary temple at Abydos dedicated to Osiris, and oversaw construction at other sites throughout Egypt. Visits to these construction sites would have introduced the young Ramses to the practical aspects of building on a monumental scale. He would have observed quarrying operations where workers extracted limestone, sandstone, and granite from cliff faces using copper tools and wooden wedges. He would have seen transportation systems involving sleds pulled by teams of men moving massive stone blocks from quarries to construction sites, sometimes requiring the cutting of special canals to allow stones to be floated on barges during the inundation season when the Nile's flood waters rose. He would have watched sculptors carving hieroglyphic inscriptions and relief scenes into temple walls, painters applying pigments to bring these reliefs to life, and architects consulting plans and directing work crews in the placement of columns, roof beams, and architectural elements. The prince's mother, Tuya, maintained her position as great royal wife throughout Seti I's reign, and likely exercised influence in court affairs and in her son's upbringing. Royal women of the 19th dynasty held significant status and occasionally appeared in temple reliefs and royal inscriptions, though their roles remained largely confined to religious ceremonies, family matters, and the management of royal households. Tuya would have overseen female attendants responsible for the domestic aspects of the prince's care and may have been involved in arrangements for his eventual marriage. Royal marriages served political purposes, strengthening alliances with powerful families or consolidating control over temple priesthoods through unions with daughters of high-ranking religious officials. By the time Ramses reached his mid-teens, preparations for his eventual assumption of royal duties would have become more explicit. The practice of co-regency, where a reigning pharaoh elevated his designated successor to share royal power while the senior king still lived, provided a mechanism for smooth succession and practical training in kingship. Historical evidence suggests that Seti I designated Ramses as co-regent while the prince was still quite young, perhaps around age 14 or 15, though the exact date of this appointment remains uncertain. Such an appointment would have involved ceremonies at major temples where the prince received royal titles, was crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and participated in rituals establishing his divine kingship. Following such an appointment, the young Ramses would have begun assuming limited royal responsibilities under his father's supervision and guidance. The responsibilities of co-regency introduced Ramses to the practical work of governing Egypt, while his father retained ultimate authority and provided guidance based on years of experience. The daily routine of a co-regent would have combined continued education with actual administrative duties, military training with campaign participation, and religious study with ritual performance. The young man would have maintained residence sometimes at Memphis, sometimes at Ramesses in the Delta, and sometimes at Thebes in Upper Egypt, where the great temples of Karnak and Luxor served as centers of religious and political power. Travel between these centers formed a regular part of royal life, as pharaohs needed to maintain presence throughout the kingdom to oversee administration, inspect construction projects, receive the homage of officials, and perform rituals at major temples. The morning routine in the royal residence began at dawn, following the principle that the king's day should mirror the sun's journey across the sky. Attendants would have woken the co-regent and assisted with washing, anointing with oils, and dressing in royal garments appropriate to the day's scheduled activities. The daily toilet involved detailed procedures reflecting the sacred character of the royal person. Specific oils and unguents were applied, sometimes scented with myrrh or frankincense. Linen garments, often pleated and of fine quality, were provided fresh each day. Wigs, commonly worn by Egyptian elites to protect the head from sun and allow better hygiene, would be placed and adjusted. Jewelry, including pectorals, bracelets, and rings, marked the wearer's royal status. When formal activities required full regalia, crowns, the ceremonial false beard, and the crook and flail scepters would be added. Following the morning preparations, the co-regent would likely have attended to religious obligations. Morning temple rituals required the presence of the king or his representative to perform the opening of the temple, the awakening and feeding of the god's statue, and the presentation of offerings. These rituals followed precise sequences established by tradition and recorded in temple archives. The king, or his designated priest, would enter the innermost sanctuary of the temple, break the seal on the shrine housing the divine statue, open the shrine doors, prostrate before the god, present offerings of food, drink, and incense, recite prescribed prayers and hymns, anoint the statue with sacred oils, dress it in fresh linen, and close the shrine again before withdrawing from the sanctuary. These morning rituals needed to be performed at temples throughout Egypt, creating a system where the king might personally perform them at one major temple while deputizing priests to perform them at others in his name. Administrative work occupied substantial portions of the day. Officials would present reports on agricultural production, temple revenues, construction project progress, military supplies, and foreign correspondence. The co-regent would have attended these briefings alongside his father, learning how information flowed through the bureaucracy and how decisions were made based on the data scribes collected and presented. Reports arrived on papyrus scrolls written in hieratic script, the cursive form of writing used for administrative purposes. These reports might detail the grain harvest in various nomes, the provinces into which Egypt was divided for administrative purposes. They might record the progress of work at temple construction sites, noting how many stone blocks had been quarried, transported, and set in place. They might summarize diplomatic correspondence from vassal rulers in Syria and Canaan, requesting military support or reporting on Hittite activities. Military affairs required regular attention, even during periods when major campaigns were not underway. The army needed continuous administration involving the provisioning of garrisons, the maintenance of equipment, the training of troops, and the organization of chariot divisions. Weapons workshops produced spears, swords, daggers, and arrows. Chariot workshops built and repaired the complex vehicles, fashioning wooden frames, fitting wheels, attaching axles, and preparing harnesses for the horses. Horses themselves required specialized care, including feeding, training, and breeding programs to maintain suitable stock for military use. The co-regent would have inspected these military installations, observing the work of craftsmen and receiving reports from military commanders about the readiness and disposition of forces. Participation in military exercises and reviews provided practical training in command and warfare. These exercises might involve chariot formations, practicing coordinated maneuvers, infantry units drilling in formation and tactics, or archery practice at targets placed at various distances. The co-regent would have practiced his own military skills during these reviews, demonstrating proficiency with the bow, spear, and sword, driving his chariot in formations with other charioteers, and learning to coordinate different military units in simulated battle scenarios. Desert hunts offered additional opportunities to practice these skills in less structured settings, while also providing recreation and demonstrating royal prowess to accompanying nobles and officers. The construction projects initiated by Seti I demanded regular supervision and inspection. The king's mortuary temple at Abydos, the hypostyle, hall at Karnak, and various other building works throughout Egypt required coordination of labor forces, delivery of materials, and quality control of craftsmanship. Visits to these sites involved detailed inspections where the co-regent and accompanying officials would examine work completed, discuss problems encountered, review plans for future work, and ensure that inscriptions and decorations followed proper iconographic and textual conventions. Architects and master craftsmen would present reports, display sketches and models, and receive instructions for continuing work. The scale of these projects was immense, with the hypostyle hall at Karnak alone requiring the placement of 134 massive columns arranged in rows and covered with carved and painted reliefs. The training in reading and composing administrative texts continued throughout the co-regency period. Royal inscriptions required careful composition to convey appropriate messages about the king's piety, military victories, building achievements, and relationship with the gods. These inscriptions followed formal conventions established over centuries using standard phrases and epithets, while also incorporating specific details of the reign being commemorated. Scribes drafted these texts, but the king needed sufficient literacy to review and approve them. Similarly, diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers followed epistolary conventions, with letters addressing protocol requirements, using appropriate honorifics, and conducting negotiations over matters such as royal marriages, military alliances, trade arrangements, and territorial boundaries. Diplomatic receptions brought foreign envoys to court, requiring the co-regent to participate in formal audiences where gifts were exchanged, messages delivered, and responses formulated. These audiences followed elaborate protocols governing how envoys approached the throne, how they addressed the king, and how the king responded to their messages. Interpreters facilitated communication when envoys spoke languages other than Egyptian. Gift exchanges accompanied diplomatic contacts, with foreign rulers sending valuable items such as precious metals, fine textiles, exotic animals, or skilled craftsmen, while Egyptian kings reciprocated with gold, grain, linen, and manufactured goods. These exchanges served both practical economic purposes and symbolic functions, demonstrating wealth, power, and the maintenance of friendly relations. Religious festivals continued to mark the passage of time and require royal participation. The co-regent would have taken increasingly prominent roles in these festivals as he gained experience and age. The beautiful festival of the valley involved a procession from Karnak across the Nile to the mortuary temples on the west bank, where offerings were made to deceased royal ancestors, and the god Amun visited these sacred sites in his portable shrine carried by priests. The Opet festival brought the images of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu from Karnak to Luxor Temple in an elaborate procession involving priests, musicians, dancers, and offerings of food and incense. The king's participation in these festivals required him to walk in procession, perform offering rituals, recite hymns, and receive the blessings of the gods as mediated through the priesthood. The management of royal estates and economic resources formed another area of learning and responsibility. The pharaoh controlled vast agricultural lands, livestock herds, workshops, and other productive assets throughout Egypt. These holdings needed administration to ensure they generated the resources required for royal consumption, temple offerings, military provisioning, and building projects. Officials called stewards managed specific estates, collecting agricultural produce, organizing craft production, maintaining accounts, and forwarding resources to royal storehouses. The co-regent learned to review these accounts, understand the productive capacity of different regions, and make decisions about resource allocation among competing demands. The examination of estate accounts provided practical education in agricultural economics and resource management. Scribes presented papyrus scrolls recording the previous year's harvest from particular estates, listing quantities of wheat, barley, flax, and other crops. They noted livestock counts, including cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. They recorded production from workshops, including quantities of linen produced, tools manufactured, pottery vessels made, and other craft goods generated. The co-regent learned to assess whether these production figures represented acceptable yields or indicated problems requiring investigation and correction. He learned to identify when officials might be concealing production to divert resources for personal use, when natural factors like insufficient flood or pest damage had reduced yields, and when improved methods or investments might increase future production. The coordination between agricultural production and military provisioning required careful planning and oversight. Military campaigns consumed enormous quantities of grain for feeding soldiers and horses. A campaign into Syria might involve transporting tens of thousands of baskets of grain from storage facilities in Egypt to supply depots along the march route and at forward bases in Canaan. The co-regent learned how to calculate the grain requirements for planned campaigns, identify which estates could provide surplus grain without creating shortages for temple offerings or civilian consumption, arrange for the transport of grain from storage sites to ports or supply depots, and ensure that backup supplies existed if campaigns extended longer than initially planned. The maintenance of chariot forces required specialized economic arrangements distinct from general military provisioning. Horses needed grain feeds of higher quality than typically consumed by humans, creating demands for particular grain varieties grown specifically for animal fodder. Chariot construction demanded skilled carpentry, metalworking for fittings and weapons, and leatherwork for harnesses. Chariot wheels required particular woods, preferably imported elm or ash, and the expertise to bend wood into circular forms and fit them with bronze tires. The co-regent observed how specialized workshops attached to military installations produced and maintained these complex vehicles, how craftsmen were recruited and trained, and how the flow of materials to these workshops was organized and funded. Marriage arrangements would have been made during these years of co-regency. Royal marriages served political purposes and followed practices that included unions with women from prominent Egyptian families and occasionally with foreign princesses sent as part of diplomatic agreements. Ramses married Nefertari, a woman whose family background remains uncertain but who became his great royal wife and most prominent queen during the early decades of his reign. He also married Isnofret, another wife who bore him several children. These marriages would have involved ceremonies combining religious ritual with diplomatic ceremony, feasting, and the exchange of gifts. The marriages established households that would need administration and created family relationships that would influence court politics and succession arrangements. The ceremonies accompanying royal marriages followed traditions that combined religious sanction with political pageantry. Priests performed rituals blessing the unions and invoking divine favor for the production of healthy heirs. The exchange of bride wealth and dowry involved transfers of gold, jewelry, fine linen, furniture, and other valuable goods between families. Feasting celebrated the marriages, with elaborate meals prepared for court officials, priests, foreign dignitaries, and other guests whose attendance demonstrated the political significance of the unions. Musicians and dancers performed during these festivities, which might extend over several days and include processions through the capital displaying the royal couple to the population. The establishment of separate households for each royal wife created administrative structures requiring oversight and resource allocation. Each household needed residential quarters within the palace complex or at separate estates, staff including attendants, servants, and guards, and regular provisions of food, clothing, and other necessities. The great royal wife's household held precedence and received greater resources reflecting her higher status, but other wives maintained their own establishments appropriate to their rank. The co-regent learned to manage these household arrangements, balance the competing claims for resources and status among different wives, and maintain harmony within the extended royal family despite the inherent tensions of polygamous marriage. Campaign participation provided the most direct training in military command and diplomacy. Seti I conducted multiple campaigns into Syria and Canaan to restore Egyptian control over regions that had become contested or independent during previous reigns. These campaigns typically launched in late spring after the agricultural work of planting had been completed and when roads were passable following the dry season. The co-regent would have accompanied his father on at least some of these expeditions, observing how campaigns were organized, how troops were deployed, how fortifications were besieged, and how negotiations with local rulers were conducted. The campaigns involved long marches through the Sinai Desert, following coastal routes or inland paths that connected wells and oases where water could be obtained for men and horses. The marching routine of ancient armies imposed physical and mental demands on all participants, including royal commanders. Days began before dawn with the breaking of camp, the loading of supplies onto pack animals or carts, and the organization of units into marching formation. The army moved in columns with scouts ranging ahead and to the flanks watching for enemy forces or obstacles. Regular rest breaks allowed soldiers to drink water and eat small rations. The day's march might cover 15 to 20 miles depending on terrain and conditions. Evening brought the establishment of new camps, with soldiers erecting tents, preparing fires for cooking, and posting guards for nighttime security. The co-regent experienced these rigors alongside the troops, learning how physical hardship affected morale and combat readiness. The logistics of campaigning required extensive preparation and organization. Supplies of grain for bread, beer, and porridge needed to be transported or obtained from local populations. Weapons and replacement equipment had to be carried along with the army. Medical supplies, and personnel accompanied forces to treat injuries and illnesses. Scouts ranged ahead of the main force to gather intelligence about enemy positions and local conditions. Scribes maintained records of distances traveled, supplies consumed, enemies killed or captured, and booty taken. After successful battles or sieges, local rulers might be confirmed in their positions under Egyptian overlordship, required to swear oaths of loyalty, provide tribute, and sometimes send sons to Egypt as hostages, guaranteeing their continued obedience. The negotiation of surrender terms with defeated cities introduced the co-regent to diplomatic practices in military contexts. Messengers would approach city walls under flags of truce, delivering demands for surrender and outlining terms that might be offered. City elders or rulers would deliberate and respond, sometimes attempting to negotiate better terms or delay surrender, hoping for relief from allied forces. The Egyptian command would consider these responses, deciding whether to offer more generous terms to speed surrender and avoid casualties from assault, or whether to reject counter-proposals and prepare for siege operations. These negotiations required judgment about military capabilities, assessment of political conditions, and the balancing of immediate tactical needs against longer-term strategic objectives. Evening routines in both palace and camp settings would have provided time for rest and private activities. The co-regent might have reviewed the day's events with tutors and advisors, discussed strategic questions with military commanders, or received instruction in areas where his father felt additional learning was needed. Evening meals were formal occasions attended by high officials and, during campaigns, by senior military officers. These meals provided opportunities for informal discussion and relationship building that complemented the formal business conducted during daylight hours. Entertainers might provide music or other performances during evening gatherings at the palace, though such entertainments would have been more limited during military campaigns. The study of precedent formed an important part of royal education. Scribes maintained records of previous reigns preserved in temple and palace archives. The co-regent would have examined inscriptions recording earlier pharaohs' military campaigns, building projects, and administrative achievements. These historical records provided models for how kings should conduct themselves, what actions brought glory and divine favor, and how royal deeds should be commemorated. The young Ramses would have studied inscriptions of pharaohs such as Thutmose III, who had conducted extensive Syrian campaigns and built widely throughout Egypt, or Amenhotep III, whose reign had been marked by monumental building projects and diplomatic contacts extending to Mesopotamia and beyond. These examples established expectations and provided templates that later kings could follow or modify according to their own circumstances and ambitions. The completion of the co-regency period came with the death of Seti I around the year 1279, before the Common Era. The transition from co-regent to sole ruler marked a formal change in status, but represented continuity in actual responsibilities, as Ramses had already been performing many royal duties under his father's supervision. The funeral of Seti I followed elaborate procedures established for royal burials. The deceased king's body underwent mummification in workshops maintained for this purpose, a process lasting 70 days, during which priests removed internal organs, dried the body using natron salt, and wrapped it in linen bandages. During this period, the new sole ruler would have overseen funeral preparations, commissioned tomb equipment, arranged for the completion of the mortuary temple if it was not yet finished, and prepared for the funeral procession and burial in the Valley of the Kings. The assumption of sole rule as Ramses II brought the full weight of royal responsibilities to the young king, who was likely in his mid-20s when his father died. The coronation ceremonies that marked this transition involved rituals at major temples throughout Egypt, but centered particularly on Thebes, where the great temples of Karnak and Luxor provided the primary settings for royal coronations. The rituals included purification ceremonies, the assumption of the double crown representing Upper and Lower Egypt, the reception of royal regalia, including the crook and flail, and the performance of offering rituals before the major deities. These ceremonies, attended by high officials, priests, military commanders, and foreign envoys, established the new king's legitimacy and divine authorization to rule. The early years of sole rule involved the consolidation of authority and the establishment of the king's own programs and priorities while maintaining continuity with his father's policies and projects. Ramses continued work on construction projects initiated by Seti I, including the completion of the hypostyle hall at Karnak and his father's mortuary temple at Abydos. He also began planning his own building projects, which would eventually surpass in scale and number those of any previous pharaoh. The young king maintained the administrative apparatus established during his father's reign, retaining experienced officials in their positions while gradually appointing his own choices to key offices as vacancies occurred through death or retirement. Military affairs demanded early attention. The situation in Syria and Canaan remained unstable, with local rulers of varying loyalty, and the Hittite Empire continuing to contest Egyptian control over the region. In the early years of his sole reign, Ramses conducted campaigns to reassert Egyptian authority over these territories. These campaigns followed patterns established during his father's reign, involving the march of Egyptian forces into Syria, the reduction of rebellious cities, and the confirmation or replacement of local rulers. Military inscriptions from these early campaigns record the capture of fortified towns, lists of enemies killed and captured, and quantities of booty brought back to Egypt, including prisoners, livestock, and valuable materials. The administration of Egypt itself required continuous oversight of the mechanisms that sustained the kingdom's economy and society. The annual Nilometer readings, which measured the height of the flood, determined predictions for the coming agricultural year and influenced tax assessments. Officials throughout the provinces collected these taxes, primarily in grain, and forwarded them to royal and temple storehouses. The irrigation system, consisting of canals, basins, and dikes that distributed floodwaters across agricultural land, required annual maintenance and occasional expansion. The king received regular reports on these matters and issued directives for addressing problems or implementing improvements in agricultural administration. Temple construction and renovation projects multiplied during these early years of sole rule. Ramses initiated work on a new temple at Abu Simbel in Nubia, far to the south of the Egyptian heartland, where massive rock-cut temples would be carved from cliff faces overlooking the Nile. He began planning additions to the Temple of Luxor and commissioned work at numerous other sites throughout Egypt. These projects required the organization of work crews, the allocation of resources from temple and royal estates, the appointment of overseers and architects, and the regular inspection of work in progress. The scale of royal building under Ramses eventually exceeded that of any previous reign, with construction and renovation occurring at dozens of sites from Nubia through the Nile Valley to the Delta. The planning of major temple projects began years before the first. Stones were quarried or carved. Architects consulted with priests about the temple's religious requirements, determining the number and arrangement of sanctuaries, the orientation toward cardinal directions or significant celestial events, and the iconographic program that would cover walls and columns. They surveyed proposed building sites, assessing the underlying rock and soil conditions, the availability of water for construction work, and the proximity to quarries or waterways that could be used for stone transport. They prepared drawings and models showing the temple's layout, the dimensions of major architectural elements, and the decorative schemes planned for different spaces. The Abu Simbel project represented an exceptional undertaking, even among Ramses' many building works. The site, located in Lower Nubia, hundreds of miles south of the traditional Egyptian heartland, required the transport of craftsmen, tools, and supplies to a remote location accessible primarily by river. The decision to create rock-cut temples rather than freestanding structures built from quarried blocks meant that sculptors would carve directly into the cliff face, removing enormous quantities of stone to create the temple's interior spaces while simultaneously carving the facade with its colossal seated statues of the king. This approach demanded different techniques and organization than traditional temple construction employed. The work at Abu Simbel proceeded in stages over many years. Initial work involved surveying the cliff face, marking the intended positions of architectural elements, and beginning the rough cutting to establish the temple's basic form. Sculptors worked from the top down, carving the upper portions of the facade before proceeding to lower levels, ensuring that debris from upper work did not damage completed lower sections. The interior spaces were excavated by cutting horizontal galleries into the cliff and then enlarging these into the temple's halls and sanctuaries. The walls, ceilings, and columns of these interior spaces received carved decoration showing religious scenes, offering rituals and inscriptions praising the king and recording his achievements. The colossal seated statues flanking the entrance to the main temple at Abu Simbel stood approximately 65 feet in height, among the largest sculptures created in ancient Egypt. These massive figures required careful planning to ensure structural integrity as they were carved from the living rock. Sculptors worked from scaffolding erected against the cliff face, using copper chisels, bronze tools, and stone pounders to remove rock and shape the statues. The work proceeded gradually, with teams of craftsmen working simultaneously on different sections under the supervision of master sculptors who ensured that proportions remained correct and that the separately carved sections would ultimately align properly. The relationship with the priesthood, particularly the powerful priests of Amun at Karnak, required careful management. The Temple of Amun controlled enormous resources and wielded significant political influence. The high priest of Amun held status second only to the king in religious hierarchy and commanded the loyalty of numerous priests, scribes, and workers attached to the temple. Ramses maintained this relationship through generous donations to the temple, regular participation in religious festivals, and the inclusion of priests in court ceremonies and royal councils. Inscriptions record substantial gifts of land, precious metals, incense, and other valuable materials given to the Temple of Amun and other major religious institutions. The administration of temple estates involved complex relationships between royal authority and priestly control. Temples owned land throughout Egypt, granted to them by kings or acquired through pious donations over centuries. These estates produced agricultural goods that supported temple operations, including the daily offering rituals, the maintenance of priests and temple staff, and the various festivals and special ceremonies that temples conducted. The temples also owned workshops where craftsmen produced goods needed for temple use or for exchange in commercial transactions. Royal officials monitored temple activities to ensure they contributed appropriately to the kingdom's overall economy while respecting the sacred character of temple property and the privileges that temples claimed under religious law. The appointment of high priests and other senior temple officials provided kings with mechanisms to influence temple policies while respecting religious traditions that gave priesthoods authority over certain matters. The king might appoint loyal supporters or family members to priestly positions, ensuring that temple hierarchies included individuals disposed to support royal policies. These appointments needed to be balanced against the claims of priestly families who considered certain positions as hereditary rights, and against the need to maintain qualified personnel who understood complex ritual requirements. The king consulted with existing temple authorities when making appointments, seeking to achieve cooperation rather than creating conflicts that might undermine both religious and political stability. Royal family matters grew more complex as children were born to the king's various wives. Nefertari bore children including several princes and princesses who would play roles in royal administration and diplomacy. Isnefret also bore children who would later hold significant positions. The growing royal family required the maintenance of households, the appointment of tutors and attendants, and eventually the arrangement of marriages for princesses and the training of princes for potential administrative or military careers. The question of succession, always important in royal households, gained urgency as the king's children reached ages where their futures needed to be determined. The education of royal children followed patterns established for the king's own training, but adapted to the circumstances of a large royal family where not all children could expect to inherit the throne. Princes received military training, instruction in administration, and religious education suitable for careers as army commanders, provincial governors, or high priests. Princesses learned household management, religious duties, and the skills appropriate to their potential roles as wives of high officials or foreign rulers. Some royal children showed particular aptitudes or interests that influenced their education and eventual careers. The king needed to provide appropriate opportunities for all his children while maintaining clear succession arrangements and preventing conflicts among potential heirs. The designation of crown princes occurred multiple times during the reign as designated heirs died before succeeding to the throne. Each designation involved ceremonies at major temples, the bestowal of titles and regalia appropriate to the heir apparent, and the gradual assumption of responsibilities that would prepare the designated successor for eventual sole rule. The deaths of designated heirs created emotional losses for the king as father, while also requiring practical decisions about succession that affected the entire court and administrative apparatus. Officials who had aligned themselves with deceased heirs needed to adjust their loyalties and relationships. Brothers of deceased heirs experienced changes in their positions within the family hierarchy and their prospects for eventual power. Diplomatic contacts with foreign powers intensified during these years. Relations with the Hittite Empire remained tense as both powers sought to control strategic territories in Syria. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in cuneiform tablets found at the Hittite capital Hattusa and in Egyptian archives reveals the formal protocols and sometimes heated exchanges between the two powers. Letters addressed rulers by elaborate titles, recited the proper formulas of greeting, and then conducted business regarding territorial boundaries, the status of vassal states, commercial arrangements, and the exchange of royal brides between ruling houses. Ramses engaged in this diplomatic correspondence while simultaneously preparing for potential military confrontation with the Hittites. The composition of diplomatic letters required careful attention to protocol and language. Scribes trained in cuneiform writing, the script used for international correspondence in the ancient Near East, drafted letters in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the period. The letters followed conventions for addressing great kings, using titles that acknowledged the recipient's status, while also asserting the sender's equal rank. The content progressed from formal greetings through discussions of current issues to requests, proposals, or complaints. The tone needed to balance firmness in pursuing Egyptian interests with courtesy appropriate to communication between equals. Kings reviewed these letters before they were sent, sometimes ordering revisions to strengthen particular points or soften language that might give unnecessary offense. The development of Ramesses as a royal capital received substantial attention and resources during these years. The city, located in the eastern Nile delta near the older site of Avaris, occupied a strategic position for controlling routes to Syria and serving as a staging area for military campaigns. Ramses expanded the construction initiated by his father, building palaces, temples, military installations, and administrative buildings. The city's position in the delta also placed it closer to Egypt's northern territories and to the routes used for Syrian campaigns than the traditional capital at Memphis or the religious center at Thebes. The construction of Ramesses required the mobilization of substantial labor forces, the transport of building materials, including stone, brought from quarries hundreds of miles to the south, and the organization of workshops producing the various goods needed for royal consumption and temple service. Agricultural administration underwent reforms and innovations during these years as the king sought to maximize resources available for his ambitious building programs and military campaigns. New lands were brought under cultivation through the extension of irrigation systems and the reclamation of marsh areas in the delta. Temple estates were reorganized to increase their productivity and ensure regular deliveries of grain and other products to royal storehouses. Officials developed improved methods for measuring land, assessing crop yields, and collecting taxes. These administrative improvements allowed for more efficient resource extraction while maintaining the agricultural base upon which all Egyptian prosperity depended. Trade relationships extended Egyptian commercial contacts to distant regions. Expeditions to Punt, a land located along the Red Sea coast in what is now Eritrea or Somalia, brought back incense, myrrh, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals. Cedar wood continued to arrive from Lebanon, essential for construction projects and shipbuilding, as Egypt lacked large trees suitable for providing long timbers. Copper came from Sinai mines, gold from Nubian territories, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan through intermediary traders. These trade connections required the maintenance of caravan routes through desert regions, the operation of harbors on the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts, and the negotiation of commercial agreements with foreign rulers controlling territories through which trade goods passed. The king's reputation as a military leader grew through the campaigns conducted during these early years of sole rule. Military inscriptions and temple reliefs depicted the king in the traditional poses of pharaonic military iconography, shown larger than surrounding figures, trampling enemies under his chariot or drawing his bow against fleeing foes. These images followed conventions established centuries earlier, but served to proclaim the current king's fulfillment of the military responsibilities inherent to the pharaonic office. The actual campaigns, conducted by armies numbering in the tens of thousands and involving complex logistics and coordination, demonstrated the king's ability to organize and deploy military force effectively in pursuit of political objectives. Royal festivals celebrated the king's achievements and reinforced his religious status. The said festival, traditionally celebrated after 30 years of rule, but sometimes held earlier, involved elaborate rituals intended to renew the king's physical and spiritual power. These rituals included races where the king demonstrated his physical vigor, ceremonies where he received the homage of gods represented by their priests, and offerings presented at temples throughout Egypt. The preparation and execution of these festivals required months of planning, the mobilization of resources for offerings and ceremonial equipment, and the coordination of priests, officials, and craftsmen whose labor made the celebrations possible. The development of royal portraiture and inscriptional programs established the iconographic and textual conventions that would characterize the reign. Sculptors produced colossal statues of the king installed at temples and public spaces throughout Egypt. These statues followed traditional conventions for royal representation, while also incorporating features that became identified with Ramses, including particular treatments of facial features, crown types, and bodily proportions. Inscriptions accompanying these statues praised the king's piety, recorded his building achievements, listed his military victories, and proclaimed his divine status as son of the gods and their representative on earth. Master craftsmen developed the skills and standards that would guide the production of thousands of inscribed monuments over the course of the long reign. The Queen Nefertari received unusual prominence during these years, appearing in temple reliefs and inscriptions more frequently than earlier Egyptian queens typically had. Reliefs showed her participating in religious rituals alongside the king, making offerings to goddesses, and appearing in scenes that emphasized her role in religious and state ceremonies. The king commissioned the construction of a smaller temple at Abu Simbel dedicated to Nefertari and the goddess Hathor, demonstrating the queen's elevated status. This temple, though smaller than the king's own temple at the site, represented an exceptional honor as queens rarely received temples dedicated to their cults during their lifetimes. Succession planning became a concern as the king's sons reached maturity. The eldest son by Nefertari, named Amun-Herkhepeshef, received titles and responsibilities appropriate to the heir apparent. Other sons held positions in the priesthood, military, or administrative apparatus. The distribution of these positions among the numerous royal children required careful management to balance family interests, maintain administrative efficiency, and preserve stability in succession arrangements. The large number of royal children, a consequence of the king's multiple marriages and the length of his reign, created both advantages in terms of personnel available for royal service and complications in managing family politics and succession claims. The accumulation of tensions between Egypt and the Hittite Empire over control of Syrian territories came to a head in the 5th year of Ramses's sole reign, around 1274, before the Common Era. The immediate cause of conflict centered on the city of Kadesh, a strategically located fortress controlling routes through Syria, and commanding allegiance or at least nominal vassalage from surrounding territories. The Hittite king Mu'attali II had assembled forces to contest Egyptian claims to this region, bringing together Hittite troops and contingents from allied and subject states throughout Anatolia and Syria. Ramses organized a major expedition to confront this challenge, mobilizing the Egyptian army in a campaign intended to secure Egyptian control over contested territories. The Egyptian army that marched into Syria consisted of 4 divisions named after major Egyptian deities: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. Each division numbered several thousand men, combining chariot forces, infantry equipped with spears, swords, and bows, and support personnel. The army followed the coastal route through Canaan and then turned inland toward Kadesh, a march of several weeks' duration requiring careful management of supplies and coordination of the division's movements. Scouts ranged ahead of the main force gathering, intelligence about enemy positions and local conditions. Scribes accompanying the expedition maintained records that would later form the basis for official accounts of the campaign, inscribed on temple walls throughout Egypt. The approach to Kadesh involved the army crossing the Orontes River and advancing toward the fortified city. According to accounts compiled from Egyptian inscriptions, scouts brought reports that the Hittite forces had withdrawn far to the north, allowing the Egyptian advance to proceed without encountering significant resistance. The division of Amun, with the king accompanying it, crossed the river and established camp northwest of Kadesh. The division of Ra followed behind, still approaching the river crossing, while the divisions of Ptah and Seth remained farther to the south along the line of march. This dispersed formation, with the divisions separated by considerable distances, reflected either confidence based on intelligence suggesting the enemy had withdrawn or a failure to properly evaluate the tactical situation. The intelligence provided by the scouts proved incorrect or deliberately misleading. Hittite forces had not withdrawn but had positioned themselves east of Kadesh, concealed from Egyptian observation. As the division of Ra approached the area where the Amun division had encamped, Hittite chariot forces launched an attack against Ra division's column, striking it while it was in march formation and vulnerable to assault. The attack caused Ra division to break and scatter, with soldiers fleeing the battlefield and streaming toward where the Amun division had established camp. The Hittite chariots pursued, and the attack quickly expanded to threaten the Amun division camp and the king's position. The situation represented a serious tactical crisis. 2 divisions were engaged or scattered, while 2 others remained too far distant to provide immediate assistance. The king's camp came under direct assault by Hittite chariot forces that had broken through the disorganized Egyptian formations. Contemporary royal inscriptions describe the king rallying his personal troops, mounting his chariot, and leading a counterattack against the Hittite forces pressing the camp. These accounts, though certainly shaped by royal propaganda requirements and the conventions of military inscriptions, indicate that the king personally participated in the fighting and that his presence and actions contributed to stabilizing the Egyptian position during the crisis. Additional factors influenced the battle's outcome. A force designated as the Niran, possibly a separate detachment that had been following a different route or reserves that arrived at a critical moment, appeared on the battlefield and engaged Hittite forces from an unexpected direction. The arrival of these fresh troops, combined with the resistance organized by the king around his camp, disrupted the Hittite attack. The Hittite chariots, having pursued scattered Egyptian forces and then engaged in fighting around the camp, became dispersed themselves and vulnerable to counterattack. The divisions of Ptah and Seth, though delayed, eventually reached the battlefield and contributed to the Egyptian recovery. By the end of the day's fighting, the Egyptians had stabilized their position but had not captured Kadesh or decisively defeated the Hittite army. The following day apparently saw both sides unwilling or unable to renew large-scale combat. The Hittites retained control of Kadesh and had not been dislodged from their positions. The Egyptians had survived a serious tactical crisis, but had not achieved their campaign objective of capturing the city and securing Egyptian control over the region. According to Egyptian accounts, diplomatic exchanges occurred in which the Hittite king Mu'attali sent messages proposing terms, though the exact nature of these exchanges and what agreements, if any, resulted remains unclear from the surviving evidence. What is clear is that the Egyptian army subsequently withdrew from the area, returning to Egypt without having captured Kadesh or established secure control over the territories they had campaigned to secure. The official Egyptian accounts of the battle, inscribed on temple walls at Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, and several other sites, presented the engagement as a great victory for the king. These accounts emphasized the king's personal bravery, described him fighting single-handedly against thousands of enemies while his troops fled, and portrayed the gods intervening to protect and strengthen him. The inscriptions included both textual narratives and elaborate relief scenes showing the king in his chariot, shooting arrows, trampling enemies, and receiving the surrender of defeated foes. These representations followed long-established conventions of Egyptian royal military propaganda and served political and religious purposes rather than providing objective historical accounts of military events. The actual strategic outcome of the Kadesh campaign was more ambiguous than the triumphal inscriptions suggested. Egypt did not secure control over Kadesh or the surrounding region. The city remained under Hittite control, and many of the Syrian territories that Egypt claimed as vassals continued to maintain complex relationships with both powers, often shifting allegiances based on which seemed more powerful or more able to protect them. The Hittite Empire, though it had not achieved a decisive defeat of the Egyptian army, had successfully defended its position in Syria and maintained its influence over the disputed territories. Subsequent years saw continued military activity in Syria as both powers sought to strengthen their positions. Ramses conducted several more campaigns into the region, though none apparently involved battles on the scale of Kadesh. These campaigns focused on securing Egyptian control over cities and territories in Canaan and southern Syria, suppressing rebellions by local rulers, and demonstrating Egyptian military capability to vassals who might be tempted to shift allegiance to the Hittites. Military inscriptions from these campaigns record the capture of cities, lists of prisoners taken, and quantities of booty brought back to Egypt, following standard formats for commemorating pharaonic military achievements. The diplomatic situation gradually evolved from military confrontation toward negotiation. Changes in Hittite leadership following the death of Muwatalli II and the accession of his brother Hattusili III created opportunities for new approaches to the relationship between the two powers. Both Egypt and the Hittite Empire faced other challenges and threats that made the continuation of their conflict over Syria increasingly burdensome. The Hittites confronted pressure from Assyria to the east and various Anatolian peoples to the north. Egypt needed to maintain stability in Nubia and manage internal administrative and economic challenges. These strategic considerations, combined with the apparent military stalemate in Syria, created incentives for both sides to seek a diplomatic resolution. Negotiations extended over several years and involved exchanges of envoys, letters, and proposals for treaty terms. The process followed diplomatic protocols that required careful attention to matters of status, precedent, and the proper forms for communication between great kings. Issues to be resolved included the definition of territorial boundaries in Syria, the status of cities and states claimed by both powers, arrangements for extradition of fugitives who fled from one kingdom to the other, and the establishment of peaceful relations that would allow for trade and other contacts. The negotiators needed to find formulas that allowed both rulers to claim they had achieved honorable terms, while also establishing practical arrangements that could reduce tensions and conflicts. The resulting agreement concluded around 1259, before the Common Era in the 21st year of Ramses's reign, established a formal peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. The treaty text, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions and Hittite cuneiform tablets, established defensive alliance provisions requiring each party to assist the other if attacked by third parties, defined procedures for the return of fugitives, and confirmed existing territorial divisions in Syria. The treaty did not represent a clear victory for either side, but rather acknowledged the approximate balance of power and the mutual benefits of ending their long conflict. Both rulers could claim achievement in securing peace and alliance with a powerful neighbor while accepting practical limitations on their territorial ambitions. The treaty relationship was reinforced through a royal marriage alliance arranged several years after the initial agreement. A Hittite princess, daughter of King Hattusili III, was sent to Egypt to marry Ramses II, arriving with an elaborate dowry and accompanied by a large retinue. This marriage followed diplomatic customs, where royal brides cemented alliances between ruling houses and created family ties between kingdoms. The Hittite princess received an Egyptian name and took her place among the king's numerous wives, though she apparently held elevated status, reflecting the political importance of the alliance she represented. Correspondence between the Egyptian and Hittite courts regarding the marriage arrangements, preserved in Hittite archives, reveals detailed negotiations over the princess's dowry, the proper honors to be shown her, and the ongoing relationship between the two royal families. The years following the treaty saw the establishment of more regular diplomatic contacts between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Envoys traveled between the two courts carrying messages, gifts, and conducting negotiations on various matters. Scribes in both kingdoms corresponded about subjects ranging from high-level political affairs to requests for medical specialists, artisans, or information about each other's territories. The relationship, though not without tensions and disputes, represented a significant change from the military confrontations that had characterized earlier decades. Both kingdoms could redirect resources from Syrian conflicts to other purposes, including building projects, campaigns in other regions, and internal administrative improvements. The internal administration of Egypt required ongoing attention throughout these years of external conflict and diplomacy. The complex system of provincial governance, temple management, agricultural taxation, and craft production continued to function under the oversight of officials appointed by the king. The vizier, holding the highest administrative office below the king, supervised this system and reported regularly on its functioning. Other high officials managed specialized areas such as the treasury, grain storage, military supplies, and temple revenues. The king needed to maintain effective working relationships with these officials, reward loyal service through appointments and honors, and address problems or deficiencies in administrative performance. Building projects initiated during the earlier years of the reign continued to demand resources and supervision. The temples at Abu Simbel, carved from living rock cliffs in Nubia, required years of work by teams of stone cutters, sculptors, and painters. The Ramesseum, the king's mortuary temple on the West Bank at Thebes, rose through the coordinated efforts of masons, carpenters, and various craftsmen. Additions to existing temples at Karnak, Luxor, Memphis, and numerous other sites throughout Egypt consumed stone, labor, and artistic skill on an unprecedented scale. The inscriptions on these structures proclaimed the king's piety, recorded his military achievements, and ensured the continuation of his cult and memory beyond his lifetime. The passage of years brought changes in royal routine and capacity. Ramses reached his 50s during the third decade of his reign, an advanced age by ancient Egyptian standards, where life expectancy remained limited by disease, infection, and the physical demands of daily life. The king's numerous children by his various wives created both administrative resources and succession complications. Many of the older princes and princesses had died before their father, whether from illness, accident, or the various hazards of ancient life. The deaths of these potential heirs required adjustments in succession planning and the elevation of younger sons to positions of responsibility. The death of Queen Nefertari occurred sometime during the middle years of the reign, removing from the court the woman who had held the position of great royal wife for decades. The exact date of her death remains uncertain, but evidence suggests it occurred after year 24 of the reign. Following her death, Istnofret appears to have assumed the position of great royal wife, though by this time several of the king's daughters had also been elevated to the status of royal wives, a practice that followed precedents from earlier Egyptian dynasties, where kings married their own daughters to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline and consolidate dynastic claims. Administrative routines established over decades continued with modifications as the king aged. The daily obligations of temple ritual, audience sessions, consultations with officials, and oversight of building projects proceeded according to patterns that had become familiar through repetition. Senior officials who had served for many years held institutional knowledge and could manage many affairs with limited direct royal involvement. Younger officials, including several of the king's sons, had been trained in administrative procedures and could assume responsibilities for particular areas of governance. This distribution of responsibilities among experienced subordinates allowed the aging king to delegate some duties while retaining ultimate authority and decision-making power. The question of succession gained urgency as the king's designated heirs died. The crown prince Amun-Herkhepeshef, son of Nefertari, who had been prepared for kingship, died before his father. His successor as designated heir, Ramses II, also predeceased the king. Other sons died in succession, each death requiring the designation of a new heir and the training of that prince for eventual assumption of the throne. Eventually, the 13th son, Merneptah, son of Istnofret, emerged as the surviving heir who would eventually succeed to the throne. Merneptah's advanced age at the time he became crown prince, probably in his 50s or 60s, reflected the extraordinary longevity of his father and the attrition among the numerous older brothers. Building projects continued even as the king aged, though the pace of new initiations may have slowed compared to earlier decades. Completion of long-running projects, maintenance of existing temples, and modifications to structures built earlier in the reign occupied resources and attention. The Ramesseum, the king's mortuary temple at Thebes, received continued work on its reliefs, statuary, and subsidiary structures. Temples throughout Egypt underwent renovations or received additional dedications. The cumulative effect of decades of building activity had transformed the architectural landscape of Egypt, with structures bearing the king's names and inscriptions visible at major sites throughout the kingdom. Religious festivals continued to mark the passage of time and require royal participation or representation. The king celebrated multiple Sed festivals, the Jubilee ceremonies traditionally held after 30 years of rule and then repeated at shorter intervals. These festivals involved elaborate rituals performed at temples throughout Egypt, but centered particularly on Memphis and Thebes. The ceremonies required the construction of temporary structures, the preparation of offerings, the assembly of priests and officials from throughout the kingdom, and the performance of rituals intended to renew the king's vitality and divine authorization. As the king aged and physical limitations increased, some ceremonial responsibilities may have been delegated to crown princes or high priests acting in the king's name, though the king's presence remained essential for the festival's full efficacy. The administration of royal estates and economic resources continued under established systems, though the aging of officials who had served since the reign's early years created needs for new appointments. Provincial governors, treasury officials, military commanders, and temple administrators who had been young men when appointed early in the reign reached their own advanced ages, and either died or retired from active service. The king appointed successors, often drawing on families that had provided loyal service for generations. These appointments maintained administrative continuity while also creating opportunities to reward supporters and bind powerful families to the throne through office holding and the privileges that accompanied high position. Foreign relations settled into patterns established by the Hittite Treaty and subsequent diplomatic arrangements. The Hittite Empire underwent its own internal changes and eventually faced severe pressures from migrations and invasions that would ultimately lead to its collapse, though these events largely occurred after Ramses's death. Egypt maintained diplomatic contacts with various Near Eastern kingdoms and continued to receive tribute or trade goods from Nubian territories to the south. The absence of major military campaigns in Syria during the later years of the reign reflected both the diplomatic resolution achieved through the Hittite Treaty and the aging king's reduced capacity for personal campaign leadership. Health challenges inevitable in advanced age would have affected the king during his final decades. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe various ailments associated with aging, including dental problems from the grit that entered bread from stone-ground grain, arthritis, and joint deterioration from the physical demands of life, and various internal conditions. The king had access to the best medical care available in the ancient world, with royal physicians trained in both practical medicine and magical healing techniques. These physicians could provide remedies for pain, treat infections with poultices and bandages, and perform the religious rituals thought to invoke divine healing. Despite these resources, the fundamental limitations of ancient medicine meant that many conditions could only be managed rather than cured. The king's daily routine in advanced age likely involved modifications to accommodate physical limitations. The elaborate morning toilet and assumption of royal regalia continued as ceremonial necessities, though perhaps performed at a slower pace. Audiences with officials might have been shorter or less frequent than in earlier years, with more business conducted through written reports reviewed by the king in his chambers. Ritual performances at temples might have involved the king seated rather than standing for extended periods, or representation by priests and princes performing ceremonies in the king's name. Travel between royal residences, once undertaken regularly, may have become less frequent, as the difficulties of the journey outweighed the benefits of presence at distant locations. The supervision of construction projects increasingly fell to appointed officials rather than requiring the king's direct presence at building sites. Master architects, sculptors, and overseers possessed decades of experience in royal construction work and could proceed with minimal oversight, following established plans and the king's general directives. The completion of major projects initiated years earlier provided opportunities for dedication ceremonies that celebrated achievement while also demonstrating continued royal piety and the maintenance of divine favor. These ceremonies brought priests, officials, and workers together to mark the completion of temples that would serve as sites of worship and repositories of the king's memory for centuries to come. Royal grandchildren and even great-grandchildren appeared at court as the reign extended beyond typical human lifespan. Some of these descendants held positions in temple priesthoods, administrative offices, or military units, continuing the pattern where royal family members staffed important positions throughout the governmental apparatus. The presence of multiple generations at court created a complex family environment where questions of precedence, succession rights, and the distribution of royal favor required careful management. The designated heir Merneptah, himself an elderly man by this point, worked to establish his own authority and prepare for his eventual succession while his father still lived and retained final decision-making power. The death of Ramses II occurred around the year 1213 before the Common Era in the 67th year of his reign. He died at an age estimated between 80 and 90 years, an extraordinary lifespan for the ancient world where most people died much younger. The death occurred at one of the royal residences, likely Pi Ramesses in the Delta, and set in motion the elaborate procedures established for royal funerals. Messengers carried news of the death throughout Egypt, informing officials, priests, and the general population that the king who had ruled for more than 6 decades had passed from life. The body of the deceased king underwent mummification in workshops maintained for royal burials. The process followed procedures that had been refined over centuries, involving the removal of internal organs, the desiccation of the body using natron salt, the application of resins and unguents, and the wrapping of the corpse in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. Priests performed rituals at each stage of the process, reciting prayers intended to ensure the king's successful transition to the afterlife. Amulets were placed among the wrappings to provide magical protection. The embalming process required approximately 70 days from death to burial, a period during which the Crown Prince Merneptah assumed the responsibilities of kingship, while preparations for the funeral proceeded. The funeral cortege that carried the king's mummified body from the embalming workshop to his tomb in the Valley of the Kings formed a grand procession involving priests, officials, family members, and representatives of the military and administrative apparatus. The procession moved from the royal residence, likely crossing the Nile from the eastern bank, where the palace stood, to the western bank, where the necropolises and mortuary temples lined the desert edge. Priests carried the shrine containing the royal mummy, while others bore canopic jars containing the preserved internal organs. Musicians and mourners accompanied the procession, performing the lamentations and rituals prescribed for royal funerals. The procession wound its way to the entrance of the tomb that had been prepared years earlier in the Valley of the Kings, the royal cemetery where New Kingdom pharaohs had been buried for centuries. The tomb, designated as KV7 in modern archaeological nomenclature, had been excavated during the king's lifetime, cut into the limestone bedrock of the valley floor, and extending through corridors and chambers decorated with painted reliefs showing scenes from funerary texts. The burial chamber, located at the end of these passages, contained a massive granite sarcophagus prepared to receive the royal mummy. Furniture, chests of clothing and jewelry, weapons, model boats, Shabti's servant figures, and numerous other objects had been placed in the tomb chambers to provide for the king's needs in the afterlife. These burial goods represented enormous wealth in materials and craftsmanship, drawn from the accumulated resources of the royal treasury and the workshops that had served the king throughout his reign. The burial ceremony involved the lowering of the mummy into the sarcophagus, the placement of the canopic jars in their designated positions, and the performance of the opening of the mouth ritual, a ceremony intended to restore the deceased's ability to breathe, speak, eat, and function in the afterlife. Priests recited prayers and made offerings while family members and high officials witnessed the final rites. When the ceremonies concluded, workers sealed the burial chamber, filled the corridors with rubble, and closed the tomb entrance. Guards were posted to protect the tomb from violation, though experience had shown that even royal tombs attracted robbers seeking the valuable goods buried with the dead. The succession of Merneptah to sole rule proceeded according to established protocols, though the new king faced the challenge of following a father whose reign had lasted longer than most people's entire lives. Merneptah, already elderly when he became sole ruler, had spent decades preparing for kingship and had served as crown prince long enough to establish relationships with officials and demonstrate administrative capability. His coronation ceremonies at Thebes and Memphis confirmed his divine kingship and established his authority to rule. The new reign would last approximately 10 years before Merneptah's own death initiated another succession. The mortuary cult, established for Ramses II, continued at his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, where priests performed daily rituals offering food, incense, and prayers to sustain the deceased king's spirit. The temple's endowment provided revenues to support these priestly activities and maintain the temple buildings. Similar cult activities continued at other temples where the deceased king had built sanctuaries or established foundations for perpetual offerings. These cults, intended to continue indefinitely, relied upon the continued functioning of Egypt's temple economy and the ongoing support of succeeding pharaohs who maintained the religious institutions that performed these services. The immediate successors to Ramses II faced challenges that had accumulated during the long preceding reign. The administrative apparatus showed signs of aging, with positions held by elderly officials or left vacant by deaths not promptly filled with new appointments. The military, though still formidable, had not faced major campaigns for decades, and questions existed about its readiness for significant conflicts. Economic pressures resulting from the massive resources devoted to building projects over 67 years had strained royal and temple treasuries. The new kings needed to address these issues while also maintaining the continuity of governance and religious observance that provided legitimacy and stability. The 19th dynasty continued for several more reigns after Merneptah, though succession disputes and brief reigns characterized this later period. None of the succeeding kings matched Ramses II's longevity or building activity. The political situation in the Near East changed as the Hittite Empire collapsed under pressure from migrations and invasions, creating new strategic conditions that Egyptian rulers needed to navigate. Internal challenges, including strikes by workers at Deir el-Medina, the village housing craftsmen who built royal tombs, indicated strains in the economic and social systems that supported pharaonic power. These developments occurred over decades following Ramses' death and represented the gradual working out of long-term processes rather than immediate crises. The architectural legacy of Ramses II's reign remained highly visible throughout Egypt. The temples at Abu Simbel, carved from cliff faces far to the south in Nubia, stood as monuments to royal power projected into distant territories. The Ramesseum at Thebes, though eventually subject to stone robbery and deterioration, retained enough of its structure and decoration to impress visitors for millennia. Additions to the temples at Karnak and Luxor showed the king's devotion to the god Amun and his integration into the long tradition of pharaonic building at these sacred sites. Statues and stelae bearing the king's names and titles stood at temples, quarries, and administrative centers throughout Egypt, creating a ubiquitous presence of royal iconography and inscription. The textual record of the reign, preserved in temple inscriptions, administrative documents on papyrus, and commemorative stelae, provided subsequent generations with accounts of military campaigns, building projects, religious festivals, and administrative policies. The Battle of Kadesh received particular commemorative attention, with multiple copies of the battle narrative and accompanying relief scenes created at several temples. These accounts presented idealized versions of events shaped by propaganda requirements and literary conventions, but they also preserved information about ancient warfare, diplomacy, and royal ideology that later scholars would study and interpret. The Hittite Treaty, preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, provided detailed evidence of ancient diplomatic practices and international relations. The mortuary temple cult and the rituals performed there continued for centuries after the king's death, though the intensity of observance gradually declined as resources diminished and political circumstances changed. The priesthood maintained the rituals as long as temple endowments provided support, but eventually economic pressures administrative changes, and the rise of new dynasties reduced the resources available for maintaining old cults. The temples themselves suffered from stone robbing as later builders removed blocks for reuse in new construction, a practical form of recycling that destroyed earlier structures while incorporating their materials into new buildings. The tomb in the Valley of the Kings suffered violation in antiquity, as robbers penetrated its seals and ransacked the burial goods despite the presence of guards and official oversight. The exact date of these robberies remains uncertain, but evidence suggests they occurred relatively soon after burial, during periods of political instability when control over the necropolis weakened. The robbers removed portable, valuable items, leaving behind furniture, stone vessels, and objects of less immediate value. Despite these depredations, the mummy of Ramses II survived in the tomb for centuries before priests of later periods, concerned about continuing tomb robberies throughout the necropolis, removed royal mummies from their original burials and cached them in hidden locations for protection. The mummy of Ramses II was eventually discovered in 1881 in a cache of royal mummies that had been hidden in a tomb at Deir el-Bahri, having been moved there by priests during the 21st dynasty several centuries after his death. The wrappings bore labels identifying the mummy and recording its removal from the original tomb and reburial in the cache. When discovered in the 19th century of the Common Era, the mummy was found to be well preserved, allowing modern scholars to study the physical remains of a king who had lived more than 3,000 years earlier. Examination revealed information about his health, age at death, and even traces of the embalming procedures used to preserve his body. The reputation of Ramses II in Egyptian historical memory evolved over the centuries following his death. Later kings occasionally referenced him in their own inscriptions as a model of successful kingship, military prowess, and pious temple building. The visible monuments he left throughout Egypt kept his name present in the landscape, even as the details of his reign faded from living memory. Greek and Roman writers who visited Egypt centuries later commented on the colossal statues and extensive ruins of temples bearing his names, though they often misidentified or misunderstood these monuments due to their distance in time and culture from pharaonic Egypt. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt by European scholars beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries of the Common Era brought renewed attention to Ramses II and his monuments. The decipherment of hieroglyphics in the early 19th century allowed scholars to read the inscriptions that covered temple walls and statues, revealing the king's names, titles, and accomplishments. Archaeological excavations uncovered temples, statues, and other artifacts from his reign. The reading of diplomatic correspondence in Hittite archives provided alternative perspectives on events the Egyptian inscriptions described. This accumulation of evidence allowed modern scholars to reconstruct outlines of the reign and place it within the broader context of ancient Near Eastern history. The assessment of Ramses II's historical significance developed gradually as evidence accumulated and scholars debated interpretations. His long reign, extensive building program, and prominent role in Egyptian-Hittite relations made him a central figure in studies of New Kingdom Egypt. The propaganda aspects of his military inscriptions became recognized, leading to more nuanced understanding of events like the Battle of Kadesh that Egyptian sources presented as great victories, but other evidence suggested were more ambiguous outcomes. The scale of his building activity, while impressive, raised questions about economic impacts and sustainability of such massive resource commitments over a 67-year period. The monuments he left continued to pose challenges and opportunities for preservation and study. The temples at Abu Simbel faced flooding threats from the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 20th century, leading to an international effort to relocate the entire structures to higher ground in an engineering project that disassembled and reassembled the rock-cut temples in their new location. The Ramesseum and other temple sites underwent conservation efforts to stabilize structures damaged by millennia of exposure to weather, earthquakes, and human activities. Statues and relief fragments from Ramesside temples entered museum collections around the world, making his artistic legacy accessible to global audiences. The figure of Ramses II in popular imagination took on dimensions shaped by both ancient propaganda and modern interpretations. The colossal scale of his statues and temples created impressions of grandeur and power that resonated across cultural and temporal boundaries. The longevity of his reign and the visible extent of his building program made him one of the most recognizable pharaohs to general audiences, though this fame rested as much on the survival and prominence of his monuments as on the actual historical significance of his political or military achievements. The man who had been born into a recently established dynasty, who had witnessed battlefield crisis at Kadesh, who had negotiated peace with the Hittites, and who had outlived most of his children to die in extreme old age, became reduced in later memory to images of colossal statues and grandiose inscriptions. The administrative systems, military structures, diplomatic practices, and religious institutions that had functioned during his reign continued to evolve in subsequent centuries, gradually transforming through the changes brought by new dynasties, foreign conquests, and cultural interactions. Egypt would experience centuries more of pharaonic rule under various dynasties, periods of foreign domination, and eventually incorporation into the Hellenistic and then Roman worlds. The structures Ramses built would slowly deteriorate, the inscriptions he carved would gradually weather away, and the memory of his specific deeds would fade from living tradition. What remained were monuments in stone, texts in archives, and the physical evidence that archaeologists and historians would later study to reconstruct fragments of a life lived more than 3,000 years before their own time. The temples stood in the desert sunlight. The statues gazed across landscapes that had changed, yet remained recognizable. The texts preserved in stone presented claims of victory, piety, and divine favor that reflected both the realities of ancient kingship and the conventions of royal representation. The body, preserved through ancient embalming techniques and modern conservation efforts, rested in a museum case available for scientific examination by researchers seeking to understand the physical characteristics of a man who had lived through decades of ancient history. The intervals of time extended backward from any present moment, through centuries and millennia, to a period when the Nile still flooded annually, when temples functioned as economic and religious institutions, when kings commissioned enormous building projects, and when one particular individual named Ramses held the position of pharaoh for an exceptionally long span of years in a world both foreign and ancestral to later ages.